At 4:11 a.m., Ramstein Air Base in southwestern Germany was operating under a low overcast that had been sitting over the Kaiserslautern Valley since the previous afternoon. The cloud base at 1,800 feet, the temperature at 7 degrees Celsius, a light wind from the northwest pushing residual moisture across the flight line. The base, home to the 86th Airlift Wing, the forward headquarters of United States Air Forces in Europe, and the Air Mobility Command hub that had been sustaining the European logistics chain for Operation Epic Fury since the conflict's first week, was 45 minutes into its pre-dawn operations cycle. Cargo aircraft were being loaded. Fuel was being transferred. The Movement's Coordination Center was processing the day's airlift manifests. The base was not a combat platform in the conventional sense. Its aircraft flew transport and logistics missions, not strike missions. What it did was make every combat platform in the theater more capable by ensuring that the parts, the fuel, the munitions, and the personnel replacements that sustaining combat operations require were moved reliably from the American logistics base structure to the forward theater at the pace the campaign demanded. Ramstein was the logistics nervous system of the European contribution to the campaign. The IRGC had spent 7 months figuring out how to reach it. Ramstein Air Base was 4,260 kilometers from the nearest point on Iranian territory. It was beyond the range of every ballistic missile in the IRGC Aerospace Force's inventory. It was beyond the effective range of every land-based cruise missile the IRGC possessed. It was, in the most literal geographic sense, outside the reach of Iranian conventional military power, as that power was conventionally deployed. That geographic reality had been the analytical starting point for the IRGC's targeting team when they had begun studying the problem 8 months before the conflict. The solution they had developed did not extend Iranian land-based range. It moved the launch point to within range. 3 vessels, ordinary commercial shipping, a Cyprus-flagged bulk carrier, a Malta-flagged general cargo vessel, and a Turkish-flagged container ship, had been acquired through a chain of shell companies and legitimate maritime acquisitions that had taken 5 months to construct. The vessels had been crewed by IRGC-trained personnel who had been given the maritime qualifications. That inspection by the Paris Memorandum of Understanding's Port State Control System required, because vessels that failed Port State Control inspections attracted exactly the kind of regulatory attention the operation could not afford. The vessels had been modified at a facility in the Iranian port of Chahbahar, a dry dock facility whose commercial function provided cover for the work, with below-deck launcher installations for Sagil-2 solid-fuel medium-range ballistic missiles. 2 missiles per vessel, 6 missiles total. The Sagil-2's range of 2,000 kilometers, fired from positions in the central Mediterranean Sea, placed Ramstein Air Base in the western Germany within comfortable engagement range. The terminal guidance of the maneuvering re-entry vehicle would provide circular error probable against point targets measured in tens of meters. The compound radar cross-section of 3 commercial vessels transmitting valid AIS signals and carrying valid documentation in the Mediterranean shipping lanes was, the IRGC's operational security assessment had concluded, essentially invisible against the background of the 7,000 commercial vessels that transited the Mediterranean every day. The operational concept was the Q-ship principle applied to ballistic missile delivery, the same fundamental idea that had been used for the 3 vessels in the Persian Gulf, scaled up to a strategic mission that no land-based IRGC system could execute. The vessels would maneuver to their pre-planned firing positions during the hours of darkness, activate their below-deck launchers, fire their missiles within a 4-minute window, and then proceed normally on their claimed commercial routes. By the time the missiles were identified and traced to their launch points, the vessels would be deep inside the commercial shipping traffic of the Western Mediterranean, their launch positions 20 miles behind them, their AIS tracks showing a seamlessly consistent transit history. The vessel's crews would proceed to port normally. Whether those crews survived long enough to reach port was not a component of the IRGC's operational planning. It was a component of the accepted cost. The 6 Sejil 2 missiles, fired from 3 positions in the central Mediterranean at ranges of between 1,900 and 2,300 kilometers from Ramstein, would arrive over Germany in approximately 15 to 17 minutes, depending on trajectory. The missile defense architecture over Germany was not equivalent to the theater-specific architecture that had been built up over 4 weeks of intensive operations in the Gulf and Levant. Germany had Patriot batteries. Germany did not have THAAD. The Patriot PAC-3 MSE batteries that protected the Ramstein area were capable, well-crewed, and had been updated with the most recent IRGC ballistic missile threat profiles, but they had never been under fire. Their crews had not experienced the combat tempo that had sharpened the Gulf theater's batteries, and the specific geometry of a Sejil 2 maneuvering re-entry vehicle arriving from an unexpected azimuth over the Mediterranean was not an engagement the batteries had rehearsed. This was the IRGC's central tactical insight. The defenses at Ramstein were capable but unproven in combat. The defenses in the Gulf were capable and thoroughly proven. The missiles would come from the direction that the Ramstein defenses were least practiced against, from a range that they had never engaged, from a trajectory that would compress the terminal engagement timeline more severely than the standard high-angle threat from the Middle East that formed the basis of most Patriot crew training in Europe. The operational concept was sound. The operational security had been close to perfect. The 3 vessels had been in the Mediterranean for 22 days. They had transited the Strait of Gibraltar, had operated in the Western Mediterranean, had conducted apparent commercial operations, including 2 port calls at Spanish and French ports that had been managed with the specific care of an operation that understood that port state control inspectors might come aboard. The inspectors had come aboard at Marseille and at Valencia. Both inspections had been passed. The below-deck modifications were not visible to port state control inspectors conducting routine safety checks. They were not supposed to be visible. They had been engineered specifically not to be. They had been visible to something else. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency's Synthetic Aperture Radar Satellite Program had been tasked on day 12 of the vessel's Mediterranean deployment against a specific collection requirement generated by an anomaly in the acoustic intelligence picture. An American attack submarine operating in the Mediterranean on a routine patrol had registered, on day 9 of the vessel's deployment, an acoustic signature from the bulk carrier that was inconsistent with its claimed mechanical configuration. The anomaly was small, a harmonic frequency in the propulsion system that suggested additional below-deck machinery not present in the Lloyd's Register entry for the vessel. The anomaly had been flagged to the collection architecture that coordinated maritime surveillance in the Atlantic and Mediterranean theater. The flag had generated the SAR satellite tasking. Synthetic aperture radar does not see what the eye sees. It does not see color, texture, or the visual characteristics that distinguish a modified hull from an unmodified one at normal observation ranges. What it sees is the precise geometry of a surface at centimeter-level resolution, regardless of cloud cover, regardless of darkness, regardless of any measure that a vessel's crew might take to conceal their modifications from visual inspection. SAR imaging of the bulk carrier's keel line, processed at NGA on days 13 and 14, showed the precise contours of below-deck launcher modifications that were not present in the standard hull profile of the vessel class. The modifications were not large. They were not visible to the port state control inspectors who had walked the vessel's accessible spaces at Marseille. They were visible to a satellite that was looking for them with the specific collection requirement that the acoustic anomaly had generated, processed by analysts who knew what a below-deck launcher installation looked like because they had spent 9 months watching the Chahbahar dry dock facility where those installations had been fabricated. The cross-referencing had taken 3 days. At 6 p.m. on day 17, the Intelligence Fusion Cell at NGA had produced the assessment that connected the Acoustic Anomaly, the SAR hull profile, the Chahbahar modification facility, and the three vessels' operating patterns in the Mediterranean into a single, coherent, operational picture. The assessment's conclusion had been stated in the careful hedged language of intelligence analysis. With high confidence, the three vessels carry concealed below-deck ballistic missile launch capability and are conducting pre-operational positioning for a strike against a European target, most probably Ramstein Air Base. The assessment had been transmitted to U.S. European Command, NATO's Allied Air Command, the German Federal Intelligence Service, and the National Command Authority in Washington simultaneously at 6:17 p.m. The assessment had reached the Ramstein Air Base Command Authority at 6:44 p.m. The decision made at the national authority level by 8 p.m. had several components. The German government was informed and consulted. The prospect of ballistic missile strikes on German sovereign territory from commercial vessels in international waters was not a decision that could be made without Germany. The consultation had produced German authorization for the American response within 31 minutes of the formal notification, the fastest NATO Article 5 adjacent authorization in the alliance's history for a response against a non-state actor using commercial cover. The vessels were in international waters in the Mediterranean, and their flag states, Cyprus, Malta, and Turkey, had been notified of the American assessment at 8:47 p.m. The notifications had been brief and factual. The vessels were assessed as carrying concealed Iranian ballistic missile systems and were to be boarded and inspected by naval forces. All three flag states had been given 30 minutes to respond. Cyprus and Malta had responded within 12 minutes with explicit authorization. Turkey had not responded within the 30-minute window. The decision not to wait for Turkish authorization had been made at 9:22 p.m., 35 minutes after the notification. The assessment of imminent employment, based on the vessel's positioning, which the collection architecture was updating every 4 minutes, and which showed all three vessels maneuvering toward their pre-planned firing positions based on the trajectory analysis, had driven the timeline. The vessels were assessed as reaching firing position within 4 to 6 hours. At 9:22 p.m., 4 hours was insufficient time to resolve the Turkish authorization question through diplomatic channels. The boarding force was not American. It was German. The KSK, Kommando Spezialkräfte, Germany's Special Operations Command, had been alerted at 7 p.m. and had deployed 3 maritime interdiction teams from their rapid deployment element. The teams were aboard maritime patrol vessels positioned in the central Mediterranean, under cover of a routine NATO maritime operation that had been ongoing for 2 weeks. The KSK teams were the sharpest edge of Germany's response to the discovery that a foreign state was attempting to strike German sovereign territory from the sea. At 11:51 p.m., the 3 boarding operations commenced simultaneously. 3 KSK teams, 12 operators each, fast roping from MH-60 Seahawk helicopters provided by the USS Baton that had been repositioned to the central Mediterranean 5 days earlier at the initiation of the intelligence collection sweep. The boardings were conducted under night vision, in radio silence, against vessels whose crews had no warning that anything was happening until the first boots hit the deck. The Cyprus-flagged bulk carrier was secured in 4 minutes and 18 seconds. The crew of 11 offered no resistance. The vessel's captain, confronted with 12 armed soldiers in full tactical kit appearing from the darkness of the Mediterranean sky, made the professional assessment that cooperation was the correct response. The captain had been in the operations planning from the beginning and understood what was below his ship's waterline. He understood, as the KSK operators secured the bridge and the below-deck spaces, that the operation had ended before it had begun, and that the appropriate posture was submission rather than martyrdom. The 6-digit code that would have activated the launcher system's safety release was in his head. He provided it to the KSK interpreter on request, without being asked twice. The Malta-flagged general cargo vessel required 6 minutes and 41 seconds. 2 crew members attempted to reach the bridge to transmit a distress signal and had to be physically restrained. The Turkish-flagged container ship required 9 minutes and 32 seconds because 1 crew member reached the below-deck launcher compartment and attempted to activate the manual launch procedure before being stopped. That crew member's attempt to activate the manual launch procedure provided, in real time, the confirmation that the intelligence assessment had been accurate. The below-deck launcher was exactly as described. The 2 Sejil-2 missiles were exactly as described. The manual launch interlock that would have fired both missiles had been partially engaged before the KSK operator who stopped him had done so. Partially engaged, not fully. The distance between the Turkish vessel's launcher compartment and the completion of the launch sequence, at the moment the KSK operator stopped the crew member, was measured afterward by the explosive ordnance disposal team that assessed the launcher system. 1 additional mechanical action, taking approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds between the world in which Ramstein Air Base received 2 Sejil-2 warheads and the world in which it did not. The KSK operator who prevented those 4 seconds from occurring filed his engagement report in the standard format. He noted the location, the time, the action taken, and the outcome. The outcome field contained 2 words: mission accomplished. All 3 vessels were secured by 12:09 a.m. 6 Sejil-2 solid-fuel medium-range ballistic missiles were in the custody of the Kommando Spezialkräfte. Their warheads intact, their guidance systems intact, their propellant loaded, but their launch sequences not completed. The intelligence value of 6 intact Sejil-2 missiles with their guidance packages available for technical exploitation was, in the assessment of the defense technical intelligence community that was already being notified of the boarding results, difficult to overstate. The specific details of the Sejil-2's maneuvering re-entry vehicle guidance algorithm, the element that made the weapon most difficult to intercept, were now available for study in a way that had not been possible from any previous collection method. Every Patriot battery crew in NATO would benefit from the exploitation of those guidance packages. The boarding had done more for NATO missile defense capability than any single prior intelligence collection event in the program's history. The response was designated Operation Trident Shield. Trident Shield was a NATO operation, the first time the alliance had formally authorized a collective military response under the Article 5 framework against an Iranian threat. Germany had triggered the Article 5 consultation at 8:33 p.m., 2 hours and 30 minutes before the boarding operation. The consultation had been brief by historical standards, 47 minutes of classified briefing to NATO ambassadors, followed by a unanimous vote, including Turkey, authorizing collective response. Turkey's vote in favor had come 11 minutes after the boarding operation began, 12 minutes before the bulk carrier was secured. The collective response addressed the Chahbahar modification facility, where the 6 vessels' launcher installations had been fabricated, the operational coordination element of the IRGC Navy's Maritime Special Operations Program that had managed the 3-vessel deployment, and the satellite communications infrastructure that the vessels had been using to receive their operational orders. F/A 18F strikes from the USS Harry S. Truman in the eastern Mediterranean addressed the operational coordination facility on the Lebanese coast that had served as the Mediterranean relay for the IRGC Navy's communications with the 3 vessels. B-2 Spirit bombers from Whiteman Air Force Base, already airborne on the authorization that had been granted at 9 p.m., struck the Chahbahar modification facility at 5:33 a.m. The GBU-57 impacts at Chahbahar, 2 weapons, 1 facility, the same progressive defeat sequence that had been employed against Fordow, registered on seismic networks in Pakistan and Oman. The facility that had converted commercial vessels into missile delivery platforms was assessed as non-recoverable structural damage. The dry dock was destroyed. The specialized fabrication equipment was gone. The 6 Sejil 2 missiles in custody aboard the 3 vessels were transferred under forensic chain of custody procedures to the NATO Defense Technical Intelligence teams that arrived on fast boats from the nearest naval vessels within 90 minutes of the boarding's completion. The technical teams had been pre-positioned, embarked on NATO maritime patrol vessels in the area at 4 p.m. when the decision to execute the boarding operation had been made and the timeline had become clear. Their job was not to disarm the missiles. The KSK EOD teams had already confirmed them as safe once the launch interlocks were secured. Their job was to begin the technical exploitation of 6 intact Sejil 2 guidance packages that had never before been available to Western intelligence services in an uncompromised condition. The Sejil 2's maneuvering re-entry vehicle guidance algorithm, the element that made the weapon most difficult to intercept, was now available for study in a way that no previous collection method had provided. Every Patriot battery crew in NATO would benefit from the exploitation of those guidance packages. Every future engagement against a Sejil 2 would be conducted with the specific knowledge of how the terminal maneuver behaved, how it timed its course corrections, and what intercept geometry was most effective against it. The boarding had done more for NATO missile defense capability than any single prior intelligence collection event in the program's history. The NATO Maritime Patrol Surveillance Enhancement was authorized at the Council meeting on the morning following the boarding. The new Maritime Intelligence Fusion Cell at Northwood would be operational within 30 days. The collection architecture that had found the 3 vessels in 22 days would be replaced by one that could find them in 8. The acoustic library that the Mediterranean Theater maintained would be expanded to include the harmonic signature of the Chahbahar modified propulsion configuration, the specific harmonic that had been the starting point of the entire collection chain. The next vessel modified at Chahbahar, or at any facility that replicated Chahbahar's techniques, would carry an acoustic fingerprint that analysts in 4 countries now knew to look for. At Ramstein Air Base, the pre-dawn operations cycle had continued through the night without interruption. The base command had been briefed on the intelligence assessment at 7 p.m. and had been updated throughout the boarding operation. The base had maintained its operations tempo. The cargo aircraft had been loaded. The manifests had been processed. The logistics chain had continued to function. At 5 a.m., as the B-2 bombers were approaching Chahbahar, the first C-17 of the morning departed the Ramstein flight line on its resupply mission to the theater. Its crew had been briefed on the general outline of the previous night's events. They had filed their flight plan, completed their pre-flight checks, and departed on schedule. The mission that the IRGC had spent 7 months preparing to disrupt was flying. In the mathematics of strategic reach, the weapon that arrives at the launch point is more dangerous than the weapon that is designed for the launch point. The IRGC had solved the range problem. They had not solved the collection problem. In the architecture of modern intelligence, the acoustic signature of a hidden propulsion system is as visible as a missile on a launch rail, to the sensor that is looking for it and the analyst who knows what it means.